Hey everybody, welcome to A.R.E. Live. I'm Mark Tier, the founder of Black Spectacles, and today I'm with Mike Newman and Frank Heintzman, and we're going to talk about the process for how to become a licensed architect. Specifically, we're really going to kind of get into the IDP and what the A.R.E. is. So we'll start by talking about the education requirements. We'll continue, as I mentioned, with a deep dive into the Intern Development Program, or the IDP, and then we'll discuss what the architect registration, or the A.R.E. Exam is and how to plan to pass it. So, but before we get started, if you would like to attend our next A.R.E. live broadcast, which will focus on our construction documents and services mock exam, you can visit blackspectacles.com/podcast to register. And during the broadcast, just like today, you'll have a chance to ask questions to the group and with Mike. Now, if you don't know Mike, he's an adjunct professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He's also the founder of Shed Studio, and he is the instructor for Black Spectacles Online AIA A.R.E. Prep Curriculum, which if you haven't already checked out our AIA A.R.E. Prep Curriculum, you can head over to blackspectacles.com to watch any of the free tutorials from those courses. And today we're also very lucky to have Frank Heintzman with us. He is the founding principal of Heintzman Architects. He's also a senior lecturer at Triton College, and he is a longtime licensing advisor for the state of Illinois. So he knows all about the IDP and A.R.E., and frankly, I think, Frank, you taught me everything that I knew or needed to know back when I was working on this. So it's pretty cool to have you here, of course. So we have Frank as well today. And then also at the end of our session, we have a special Black Spectacles promo code that I'd like to share, so stay tuned to hear about that at the end. But first, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Mike.
Okay, thanks, Mark. As Mark said, today we'll be discussing the sort of basics of the process, how to literally get started, and what the heck is the license process anyway. There are essentially a few simple categories that we'll be discussing, as Mark mentioned, this sort of idea of education, experience, and then the examination. And these are essentially a fairly simple process. For most folks, the simple aspects of it will work just fine. Now, it's easy for me to say, it's just money and time. But for a few people, there'll be snags along the way. And so those snags along the way can be a really big problem. There's nothing worse than working for a few years, than figuring out that you're not eligible and have to start over. So let's try to help that not to happen. So as Mark said, today we have our expert in the house, Frank Heintzman. Frank was a young man teaching this material back when I was going through the process many years ago. And the two of us have been doing this back and forth for quite a long time. And he's definitely the go-to guy on these topics as far as I'm concerned. I think we're sort of ready to jump in and start chatting away.
Well, thanks, Mike, for inviting me. I'm pleased to be here and to help out as many interns as I can get through this process. It looks on the surface to be extremely complicated, but in reality, it's pretty simple. There's 3 steps. Get an education, go through an internship, take and pass the A.R.E., and you can become licensed in any state in the United States and any province in Canada.
That sounds so easy. How hard can this be?
It sounds easy, but it is a process that you have to go through. And of course, the number one thing that you should do is to sign up for the IDP if you haven't done that already, regardless of what your educational experience or your educational completion is. You can sign up for IDP as soon as you graduate from high school and begin earning intern credits, experience credits, toward the total number that you need, the 3,740 hours that you need to supplement your education. And internship is a process of learning by doing. That's the whole idea behind it. You learn the theory in school, and you learn the practice in working for an architect.
And that's kind of speaks to the history of all of this as well. Like kind of the early days of architectural licensure was really all about being going through an apprentice process. And so it was kind of getting that experience in the field working for somebody who was already an established architect.
That's true. When I was in school, I was working for an architect near my hometown down in southern Illinois. And he was telling me at that time that there were many architects that he knew that didn't even go to school. They simply went to work for an architect for 8 years. They were able to take the licensing exam and pass it, and then they became architects. And he always kind of turned his nose up at those people because they didn't have the full educational experience that he had, that he went through. And so it almost was a divided profession in those days, those that had been to school and those that hadn't been to school.
And so then along the way, there was sort of a decision made to kind of formalize this and make it more of a specific process.
Well, yeah, the National Council of Architectural Registration Boards, which represents all of the licensing authorities in the 55 jurisdictions in the United States, there are 50 states and 5 territories, you might say, including Washington, D.C. That was organized back in the 60s, and there was a kind of a Wild West attitude toward licensing before then, that every state was on its own. And for the longest time, Illinois was the first state to require professional registration to become an architect. Other states just let anybody who wanted to. In fact, Daniel Burnham was trained in pharmacy. I don't know if you know that or not, but he never actually got a degree in architecture. But yet he ran one of the biggest architectural firms in Chicago. But there was a movement in Illinois to try to become more professionalized in the approach to practice. And that spread throughout the country, but it was still, every state was on its own. So NCARB, as it's called, the National Council of Architectural Registration Boards, figured out that there ought to be a regular way of doing it, so that if an architect in Illinois should be able to practice in Wisconsin and Indiana and Missouri and Michigan and other states that they were getting jobs in. And so their process became the standard process that's used throughout the country. And every state has accepted this process, including Illinois.
So there's a bunch of aspects of this that are the same throughout the country. It doesn't really matter what you do. The exam is essentially the same. There's a few add-on parts in a few states, but essentially it's the same exam everywhere, for example. But there's still kind of a legacy of different states having some of their own, like it's the jurisdiction is by state.
Yeah, every state
national.
has its own licensing laws, but those laws have become pretty standardized. The state of California, for example, has an additional exam that you have to take that relates to their state building code, and you have to know things about earthquake-resistant design, for example, and other things that are peculiar to California. But virtually all the other states have a standardized methodology. Illinois is a little bit unique in the sense that they take a long time to make adjustments to the new regulations that are suggested by NCARB. NCARB provides advice to the states, but the states don't have to take them necessarily. And so Illinois is a little bit behind the other states in terms of the shortening of the internship period, for example. I don't know if you know that or not, Mike, but NCARB has passed a resolution that allows interns to only earn 3,740 credits as opposed to 5,160.
Yeah.
And they've reduced that by taking out the supplemental practice requirements, which are not really true practice. You can get supplemental experience in Illinois, for example, by doing the Emerging Professionals Companion, which is a series of case studies that the AIA has produced, and you read those, you answer the questions at the end, and you submit them, and you get credit for it. But that's a
sort of
far
like,
distance from practice.
It's more like continuing education.
It is. That's basically what it is. So they will eliminate. NCARB is recommending that states eliminate that. Illinois hasn't done that yet, for good reasons. And I don't know if I need to go into what those reasons are, but there are a lot of reasons for it. But they will very soon.
And most of the states are kind of on board with
virtually all the other states are.
Virtually, yes. Way to go, Illinois! Always on top of this.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but there are still, like, one of the things that I'm sure we'll mention a couple of times in this hour is the idea that you really do have to check with your state's licensing board to make sure that you're following this very specific issues.
Very good point.
Well,
yes.
Generally everything will be very similar, and pretty much everything we talk about will be applicable across the country, and in some other related, in Canada, for example, is a very similar process.